Some losses break you in ways you never recover from. Ray Henderson knew this truth all too well after losing his beloved wife to cancer and watching his carpentry business crumble in the same year. At 54, he found himself starting over with his teenage daughter Emma in the rundown farmhouse he inherited from his estranged father. The old place needed work, especially the overgrown backyard that hadn't been touched in decades. While clearing the brambles, Ray's shovel struck something impossible. A perfect hole in the ground, glowing red-hot and smoking like a furnace. The earth around it felt warm, even on cold mornings. Ray thought it was just an old septic problem. Then Emma started hearing whispers at night. She claimed she saw shadows moving inside the hole. When Ray found his father's hidden journals, he realized this wasn't about plumbing. His family had been keeping a dark secret buried in that backyard for generations. What was his father hiding? Down there? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Ray Henderson first saw his father's house, frost still clung to the October grass, like nature's way of warning him away. He sat in his dented pickup truck, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the two-story farmhouse that now represented his last chance at stability. Emma sat beside him in sullen silence, her dark hair falling across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. "It looks worse than the photos," she said finally, her voice carrying that particular brand of teenage disdain that had become her default tone since Sarah's funeral 6 months ago. Ray couldn't argue. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing grey wood underneath that looked like old bones. Shutters hung at odd angles, and the wraparound porch sagged under the weight of years and neglect. His father, Thomas Henderson, had lived here alone for 32 years after Ray's mother died, and it showed. "We'll make it work," Ray said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He still wore Sarah's wedding ring on a chain around his neck, tucked beneath his flannel shirt, where it rested against his heart like a constant reminder of everything he'd failed to protect. They'd been married 25 years when the doctors found the tumor. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, they said, using that clinical tone medical professionals adopted when delivering death sentences. 18 months to live. If she was lucky, she got 14. The medical bills had come fast and merciless. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments and specialist consultations had consumed their savings, then their retirement fund, then the equity in their home. Ray had worked 16-hour days trying to keep his carpentry business afloat, while caring for Sarah, but grief and exhaustion made him sloppy. He'd miscalculated a load-bearing wall renovation that cost him his contractor's license and the trust of clients he'd served for 15 years. Now, here they were, father and daughter, sitting in a truck that needed new brakes, looking at a house that needed everything, with $3,000 between them and complete destitution. "Dad?" Emma's voice was softer now, uncertain. At 16, she was caught between the cynical armor of adolescence and the frightened child who'd watched her mother waste away in a hospital bed. "Are we really going to be okay?" Ray reached over and squeezed her hand, noting how thin her fingers had become. She'd lost weight since Sarah died, picking at her food like a bird, as if eating might somehow betray her mother's memory. Her therapist, back in Philadelphia, had called it survivor's guilt, but Ray thought that was just a fancy term for the simple, brutal fact that sometimes the wrong person dies first. "We're going to be more than okay," he said, and for the first time in months, he almost believed it. "This is our fresh start." The key his father's lawyer had mailed him still felt foreign in Ray's pocket as they walked up the front steps. The porch boards groaned under their weight, and Ray made a mental note to check the foundation joists. If the house was going to collapse, he'd rather know sooner than later. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that slanted through grimy windows. The furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts of a life Ray had deliberately avoided for 20 years. His last real conversation with his father had been an argument about Ray's choice to marry Sarah instead of staying close to home and learning the family business. Ray had stormed out, young and righteous, and certain that his father's disapproval said more about Thomas Henderson's narrow mind than Ray's character. He'd been wrong about many things in his life, but Thomas Henderson's narrow mind hadn't been one of them. "It smells like old man," Emma said, wrinkling her nose as she explored the living room. She pulled the sheet off an ancient recliner, releasing a cloud of dust that made her cough. "That's the smell of someone who lived alone too long," Ray replied, though he wondered if that was his own future, growing old and brittle in isolation, letting the world decay around him while he nursed old wounds and older regrets. The kitchen hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with avocado green appliances and linoleum that curled at the edges, but it was clean, obsessively so, and Ray found that oddly comforting. His father might have been many things: stubborn, secretive, impossible to please, but he'd maintained standards. They spent the afternoon exploring their new home, carrying in their few remaining possessions from the truck. Ray had sold most of their furniture to pay for Sarah's final round of treatments, keeping only what would fit in the pickup bed: clothes, Emma's art supplies, Sarah's jewelry box, and a photo album that documented 25 years of marriage and 16 years of parenthood. Emma claimed the bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway, as far from the master bedroom as possible. Ray understood. She'd spent too many nights listening to her mother's labored breathing through thin walls. Distance felt safer now. Ray took his father's room, stripping the bed and opening the windows to let October air chase away decades of accumulated loneliness. He found Sarah's wedding ring in his jacket pocket and held it up to catch the light. White gold with a modest diamond. All they'd been able to afford when they were 25 and thought love could conquer anything. Love conquers many things, but cancer isn't one of them. That evening, they ordered pizza from the only restaurant in Millbrook that delivered to their rural address. Emma picked at her slice while scrolling through her phone, documenting their new reality for friends back in Philadelphia, who were probably glad to see the sad girl move away. "No internet yet," she announced, as if this were the final proof of their exile from civilization. "I'll call the cable company tomorrow," Ray promised. "Tonight, we could just talk." Emma looked at him like he'd suggested they communicate through smoke signals. "About what?" "About your mother. About how sorry I am that my failures brought us here. About how scared I am that I don't know how to raise a teenage daughter on my own. About the way you sometimes look at me like you're measuring the distance between disappointment and hatred. About whatever's on your mind," he said instead. She shrugged and returned to her pizza. Ray let the silence stretch between them, familiar as an old ache. They'd stopped talking months ago, somewhere between the third oncology appointment and the day Sarah stopped recognizing their faces. Later, as Emma settled into her new room with the portable CD player she'd insisted on bringing, Ray walked the perimeter of their property. The farmhouse sat on 2 acres of what had once been working land, though his father had let most of it return to wild. The backyard was a tangle of brambles and volunteer trees, choked with the kind of aggressive growth that happens when nature reclaims abandoned spaces. That's when he saw it, a section of the yard where nothing grew. The bare patch was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across, sitting in the middle of what should have been the densest part of the overgrowth. Ray pushed through the brambles to get a closer look, noting how the thorns seemed to curve away from the spot, as if even they were reluctant to cross that boundary. The earth was dark and rich, but completely barren. Not even weeds grew there. Ray knelt and pressed his palm to the ground, then jerked his hand back in surprise. The soil was warm, not sun-warmed. The temperature was dropping fast as evening approached, and this part of the yard had been shaded all day. This was heat from below, as if the earth itself was running a fever. Ray found a stick and poked at the ground, expecting to hit rock or clay or some explanation for the anomaly. Instead, the stick slid down into soft earth, deeper than it should have been able to go. He pushed harder, and the stick disappeared entirely, swallowed by soil that gave way like quicksand. He scrambled backward, heart hammering against his ribs. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, harsh and mournful. Ray stared at the spot where his stick had vanished, waiting for some rational explanation to present itself. None came. Back in the house, he found Emma in the kitchen, heating water for tea. She'd always been a creature of ritual, finding comfort in the familiar. Before Sarah got sick, their evening routine had included homework help, bedtime stories, and gentle arguments about appropriate sleepwear. Now Emma made her own tea and retreated to her room like a tenant avoiding an awkward landlord. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting his expression. Ray considered telling her about the warm patch of earth, then decided against it. Emma had enough to worry about without adding her father's overactive imagination to the list. "Just getting used to the quiet," he said. "City noise spoils you for country living." Emma nodded and headed upstairs with her mug, leaving Ray alone with his thoughts and the lingering sense that something in their new backyard was very wrong. He stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark tangle of overgrowth, and tried to convince himself that warm soil was perfectly normal. Underground springs, maybe, or a broken septic line. Tomorrow, he'd investigate properly, with tools and daylight and a reasonable explanation for everything. But as he climbed the stairs to bed, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that his father's house was keeping secrets, and that some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Outside, October wind rattled the windows like something trying to get in, or trying to warn them to get out. Ray woke to the sound of whispers. For a moment, caught in the hazy space between sleep and consciousness, he thought Sarah was talking to someone downstairs. His heart leaped with the irrational hope that the past year had been nothing more than an elaborate nightmare, that he'd wake to find his wife making coffee and discussing weekend plans with Emma. Then reality crashed back, heavy and final as a coffin lid. He sat up in his father's bed, listening. The whispers continued, too indistinct to make out words, but clearly human voices engaged in urgent conversation. Ray checked the bedside clock. 3:17 a.m. Emma. It had to be Emma. Maybe video calling friends back in Philadelphia, or crying into her phone to some boy she hadn't told him about. Teenagers needed their secrets, their private spaces, to process grief in ways that adults couldn't understand or intrude upon. Ray pulled on his jeans and padded barefoot down the hallway to Emma's room. Her door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see her sleeping form curled under her grandmother's quilt. Her breathing was deep and even, the rhythm of genuine sleep. The whispers continued, drifting up from somewhere below. Ray descended the creaking stairs, every instinct screaming that he was making a mistake. The voices seemed to be coming from outside, near the back of the house, where he'd found that strange patch of bare earth. He grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped onto the back porch. October night air bit through his t-shirt, raising goosebumps along his arms. The whispers stopped abruptly, as if his presence had interrupted a private conversation. Ray stood perfectly still, listening to nothing but wind through the trees and his own thundering heartbeat. He was turning to go back inside when the smell hit him. Sulfur and something else, something organic and corrupt, like meat left too long in a warm car trunk. The beam of his flashlight swept across the overgrown yard until it found the bare patch. What he saw there made him drop the flashlight, plunging the yard into darkness. The patch wasn't bare anymore. It was a hole. Ray fumbled for the flashlight with shaking hands, its beam dancing wildly before settling on the impossible sight. A perfect circle had opened in the earth, maybe 3 feet across, going down into absolute blackness. Wisps of acrid smoke drifted up from the depths, carrying that awful smell of decay and corruption. As Ray watched, frozen in disbelief, a faint red glow pulsed from somewhere far below, like the dying ember of a cigarette magnified beyond all reason. The heat radiating from the hole turned the October air above it into visible waves, distorting the darkness beyond. This was impossible. Ground didn't just open up overnight, not in perfect circles, not with heat and smoke and that terrible smell that made Ray's stomach churn. There had to be an explanation, a broken gas line maybe, or some kind of sinkhole caused by underground erosion. But even as his rational mind scrambled for reasonable answers, Ray knew this was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting beneath his father's carefully maintained yard, held back by whatever methods Thomas Henderson had used to keep it contained, until now. Ray backed toward the house, never taking his eyes off the smoking hole. As he reached for the porch door, a sound drifted up from the depths that made his blood freeze. Not whispers this time, but a low moan of hunger that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. He slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, then stood, with his back pressed against the wood, breathing hard. Through the kitchen window, he could see the red glow pulsing like a heartbeat, steady and patient and utterly alien. Ray spent the rest of the night at the kitchen table, watching that horrible light and trying to convince himself he was having some kind of breakdown. Grief did strange things to the mind. Everyone knew that. Maybe the stress of losing Sarah, losing his business, losing everything that had given his life meaning, had finally snapped something inside his brain. But when morning came and the hole was still there, still smoking in the pale dawn light, Ray had to face the possibility that his father's house came with problems that couldn't be solved with carpenter's tools and common sense. Emma found him at the table, still staring out at the backyard. "Dad, you look terrible." Ray turned to see his daughter standing in the doorway, wearing one of Sarah's old college sweatshirts, and looking more concerned than he'd seen her in months. The sight of her in Sarah's clothes hit him like a physical blow, but it also reminded him why he couldn't afford to fall apart. "Didn't sleep well," he said, still adjusting to the new place. Emma poured herself a bowl of cereal and sat across from him. "What's that smell? It's like something died." Ray's pulse quickened. If Emma could smell it too, then he wasn't losing his mind. "I think there might be a problem with the septic system. I'll need to call someone to take a look." Emma glanced toward the window, then back at her father. "Dad, why is there smoke coming from our backyard?" There was no hiding it now. Ray stood and gestured for Emma to join him at the window. Together, they looked out at the impossible hole, still breathing heat and corruption into the morning air. "I found it last night," Ray said quietly. "I'm not sure what it is." Emma stared for a long moment, her face pale but remarkably composed. At 16, she'd already learned that impossible things could happen, that safe worlds could collapse without warning. Cancer had taught her that lesson more thoroughly than any teenager should have to learn. "It wasn't there yesterday," she said. "No, it wasn't. So it just appeared?" Ray nodded. "Ground doesn't usually do that." Emma was quiet for several minutes, studying the hole with the same analytical intensity she'd once applied to her mother's medical charts, trying to find patterns that might predict the unpredictable. "We should explore Grandpa's stuff," she said finally. "Maybe he left something that explains this." It was the first time Emma had referred to Thomas Henderson as Grandpa instead of your father. Ray took it as a small but significant step toward accepting their new reality. They started in the basement, a dim space that smelled of old wood and machine oil. Ray's father had been methodical about organization, with labeled shelves for tools, hardware, and seasonal decorations. But behind the water heater, Emma discovered something Ray had missed during their initial exploration: a false wall. The paneling looked identical to the rest of the basement, but Emma had noticed that the electrical outlets on one section were slightly higher than the others. When Ray pressed on the panel, it swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small room that had been carefully concealed. Thomas Henderson's secret study was spartanly furnished: a desk, a filing cabinet, and shelves lined with journals. The air inside was stale but clean, as if the room had been sealed for months. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, open to an entry dated 3 days before Thomas Henderson's death. Ray picked up the journal with trembling hands and read. Aloud, October 15th. It's getting worse. The offerings aren't working anymore, or maybe I'm just too old and tired to do them properly. The hole opened again last night, wider than before. I can hear it calling, hungry and angry. I've failed in my duty, failed the way my father warned me I might if I didn't stay strong. If something happens to me, if Ray ever comes back here, he needs to know the truth. This isn't just land we inherited. It's a responsibility, a burden. The thing down there has been waiting for decades, growing stronger, and now I don't think I can hold it much longer. God forgive me for what I'm about to try. God forgive me for what I've left undone. The entry ended there, but the journal was one of dozens. Ray pulled another from the shelf at random and found page after page of meticulous observations. Temperature readings, measurements, detailed descriptions of sounds and smells, and things that shouldn't exist. His father hadn't been the narrow-minded man, Ray remembered. Thomas Henderson had been a guardian, standing watch over something terrible and patient, protecting the world from a threat that Ray was only beginning to understand. Emma found a folder labeled Family History and spread its contents across the desk. Photographs, letters, newspaper clippings, and documents dating back more than a century. The pattern was unmistakable. Generation after generation of Henderson men, all living on this same property, all dying young from what the death certificates called natural causes, but which the family journals described in very different terms. Dad, Emma said softly, pointing to a photograph from 1962. That's Grandpa with his father. And look at this. She'd found a letter written in Thomas Henderson's careful handwriting, addressed to Ray but never sent. The date was 6 months before Thomas died. My son, it began, I know you think I was a hard man who drove you away with my demands and expectations. You're not wrong. But I was trying to prepare you for something you weren't ready to understand. Our family carries a burden that goes back generations. We are guardians, keepers of something that must never be allowed to escape. I'm getting old, and the thing below grows stronger. I had hoped you would come home, that we could talk, that I could teach you what your grandfather taught me. But I drove you away instead, and now I don't know how to bring you back without explaining things you would never believe. The hole in the backyard isn't natural, it's a prison, and I'm afraid that when I die, there will be no one left to keep the door locked. Ray set the letter down with shaking hands. Outside, the October wind had picked up, rattling the basement windows like something trying to get their attention. Emma was reading through more of the journals, her face growing paler with each page. Dad, she whispered, I think we're in serious trouble. Above them, coming from the direction of the backyard, they heard a sound that made them both freeze. The whispers had returned, but now they were louder, more insistent, and coming from multiple voices speaking in languages neither of them recognized. The thing in the hole was waking up, and Thomas Henderson was no longer there to keep it contained. Ray spent the next 3 days reading his father's journals with the methodical intensity of a man trying to decode his own death sentence. The entries painted a picture of Thomas Henderson as a reluctant guardian who'd inherited both the knowledge and the burden from his own father, going back at least 4 generations. The pattern was always the same. The eldest son learned the truth on his 18th birthday, took over primary responsibility when his father died, and spent the rest of his life maintaining what the journals called the containment, the thing, beneath the earth, never named directly, only referred to as it or the hunger, required regular attention to keep it dormant. Emma had thrown herself into research with typical teenage obsession, turning their kitchen table into a command center of family documents, local newspaper archives she'd found online, and notebook pages covered with her careful handwriting. She'd always been good at puzzles, at finding patterns that others missed, and she approached their supernatural inheritance with the same analytical mind that had once helped her mother track cancer treatments and side effects. "Look at this," she said on Wednesday morning, spreading out a collection of newspaper clippings from the 1960s and 70s. "Every few years, there are reports of missing pets in this area, dogs and cats that just vanished overnight, no trace of them ever found." Ray looked up from a journal entry dated 1987 that described his father's attempts to measure the temperature fluctuations around the hole. "Animals can sense things we can't," he said. "Maybe they were drawn to it, or maybe Grandpa was feeding them to it." The casual way Emma said it made Ray's stomach turn, but he couldn't dismiss the possibility. The journals were full of references to offerings and maintaining the balance, though Thomas Henderson had never been specific about what those offerings entailed. That afternoon, Ray decided to excavate around the hole's perimeter, hoping to find some clue about its true nature or origin. The heat radiating from the opening made the work exhausting, even in October's cool air. Every shovelful of dirt revealed more questions than answers. 2 feet down, his spade struck something that rang like metal. Ray knelt and brushed dirt away from what turned out to be a tarnished silver locket, still attached to a chain that had been severed as if cut with shears. The locket opened with a soft click, revealing a faded photograph of a woman Ray didn't recognize. She had Emma's dark hair and serious eyes, but the clothing and hairstyle suggested the photo was from the 1940s or 50s. On the opposite side of the locket was an intricate symbol that matched markings Ray had noticed carved into trees around the property's perimeter. "Who is she?" Emma asked when Ray showed her the discovery. "I don't know, but this symbol appears in your great-grandfather's journals too." Ray flipped through the oldest journal, finding a page where the same symbol was drawn repeatedly, as if the writer had been trying to memorize its exact form. That evening, Emma's appetite disappeared entirely. She sat at dinner, picking at her food, while Ray watched her growing thinner and more withdrawn. Dark circles had appeared under her eyes, and she startled at every sound: the house settling, wind through the trees, the distant call of night birds. "I keep having the same dream," she said finally. "I'm standing by the hole, and someone is calling my name from inside it. A woman's voice. She sounds scared." Ray felt cold, despite the warmth from the kitchen radiator. "What does she say?" "She tells me to run, that it's not safe here, but when I try to leave, I can't move my feet. It's like they're rooted to the ground." Emma pushed her plate away, her dinner barely touched. "Last night I dreamed I could see her face in the glow from the hole. She looked like the woman in that locket." Ray reached across the table and took his daughter's hand, noting how cold her fingers felt. "They're just dreams, Em. Stress and grief can play tricks on your mind." But even as he said the words, Ray wondered if Emma's dreams were something more than psychological processing. The journals mentioned that some family members had what Thomas Henderson called sensitivity, an ability to perceive things that others couldn't. It was treated as both a gift and a curse, useful for understanding the entity's moods, but dangerous in its own right. "Maybe we should call someone," Emma said quietly. "A priest or something. People who deal with this kind of stuff." Ray had already considered that option, but Thomas Henderson's journals were explicit about maintaining secrecy. "The moment we involve outsiders," one entry warned, "we lose control of the situation. This is a family responsibility, and outsiders wouldn't understand the delicate balance required to maintain containment." "We need to learn more about our family first," Ray said. "Uncle Frank might have answers." Frank Henderson was Thomas's younger brother, living in a retirement community outside Pittsburgh. Ray had seen him at his father's funeral, but they'd barely spoken, just a brief, awkward exchange of condolences. Frank had always been the black sheep of the family, the one who'd escaped small-town life for a career in insurance sales. Ray called that evening, catching Frank just as he was finishing dinner. "Ray? Well, I'll be damned. How are you settling into the old place?" "It's been interesting," Ray said carefully. "I was wondering if we could talk about some family history. Dad left behind a lot of papers I don't understand. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Frank spoke again, his voice had lost its jovial tone. What kind of papers? Journals, going back decades. They mentioned things about the property that don't make sense. Another pause, longer this time. Ray could hear a television in the background, some comedy with a laugh track that seemed obscenely cheerful, given the circumstances. Frank, are you still there? I'm here just trying to figure out how to say this. Frank's voice was quiet now, almost conspiratorial. Your father and I had an understanding. He never talked to me about the family business, and I never asked questions. It was better that way. What family business? The kind that kills people, Ray. The kind that took our father when he was 52 and your grandfather when he was 48. The kind that was going to take your father eventually, whether cancer got him first or not. Ray felt the kitchen walls closing in around him. You knew? I knew enough to stay away. When I turned 18, Dad sat me down and explained about our families, responsibilities. He gave me a choice. Stay and learn the family trade, or leave and never come back. I chose to leave, but Dad stayed. Thomas was the older son. It was his burden to carry, and he carried it for 32 years, Ray. 32 years of whatever the hell goes on at that property. I used to have nightmares about it, even living 3 hours away. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the serious tone of Ray's voice. She sat across from him, listening to his half of the conversation with growing concern. Frank, I need you to tell me everything you know. No, you don't. Trust me on this. What you need to do is pack up your daughter and get as far away from that place as possible. There's a reason our family dies young, and it's got nothing to do with genetics. The line went dead. Ray stared at the phone, then at Emma's pale, frightened face. He hung up on me. What did he say? Ray repeated Frank's warning, watching Emma process the information with that unsettling calm she'd developed since her mother's death. She was too young to be this composed in the face of supernatural threats, but grief had aged her beyond her 16 years. We can't leave, she said finally. Why not? Because if we do, that thing gets loose, and then other families go through what we're going through. Emma stood and walked to the window, looking out at the red glow that pulsed steadily in their backyard, like a malevolent heartbeat. Mom always said that sometimes you have to do the right thing even when it's hard. Ray joined her at the window, putting his arm around his daughter's thin shoulders. The weight of generations pressed down on them both, all those Henderson men who'd lived and died keeping this secret, maintaining this terrible vigil. Outside, the whispers had started again, drifting up from the hole like prayers in a language that predated human speech. Frank Henderson arrived 2 days later, driving a pristine Honda Civic that looked out of place in their gravel driveway. He was smaller than Ray remembered, with the careful grooming of a man who'd spent his career in customer service. But his eyes carried the haunted quality Ray was beginning to recognize in his own mirror. I couldn't sleep, Frank said by way of greeting. Haven't had a decent night's rest since you called. Kept thinking about what might happen if you didn't know what you were dealing with. Ray led his uncle to the kitchen, where Emma had prepared coffee and laid out the family documents like evidence in a criminal trial. Frank took one look at the spread of journals and photographs and visibly paled. Jesus, Tommy kept all this. 32 years worth, Ray said. Maybe you can help us understand what we're looking at. Frank sat heavily, his hands trembling as he reached for a coffee cup. I'll tell you what I know, but it's not much. I spent 40 years trying to forget these things, and I was mostly successful until yesterday. He picked up the silver locket, turning it over in his fingers with obvious reluctance. This belonged to our Aunt Catherine, Dad's sister. She was supposed to be the next guardian. Sometimes it skipped to daughters when there were no sons, or when the sons proved unsuitable. But Catherine tried to destroy the thing instead of containing it. Emma leaned forward intently. What happened? To her? She disappeared one night in 1952. They found her locket and some of her clothes near the hole, but never found her body. Dad always said she'd been consumed by her failure. But I think what he really meant was that the thing down there had finally gotten what it wanted. Frank opened the locket and stared at Catherine's photograph. She was 19, beautiful and brave, and absolutely certain she could end the family curse. The night she disappeared, she'd stolen some kind of ritual knife from Dad's workshop and announced she was going to kill the thing once and for all. Ray thought about the hole's perfect circular shape, its unnatural heat, the way it seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. What exactly is it? Frank was quiet for a long time, studying the documents spread across the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Dad called it a hunger. Not just hungry, hunger itself. Like it was the physical manifestation of an appetite that could never be satisfied. Frank set down the locket with shaking fingers. According to family stories passed down from our great-great-grandfather, the thing came from somewhere else. Not another country, another place entirely. It got trapped here somehow, imprisoned by people who knew how to deal with such things. Emma had been taking notes in her careful handwriting. Native Americans? That was always my assumption. This land was sacred to several tribes before white settlers arrived. Maybe they had ways of dealing with supernatural threats that we lost. Frank gestured toward the window where the hole's red glow was visible even in afternoon light. Our family didn't create this problem. We inherited it when great-great-grandfather bought the land in 1887, and we've been dealing with the consequences ever since. Ray found a bundle of letters tied with string and spread them across the table. The paper was yellowed and fragile. The ink faded to brown, but the handwriting was still legible. The correspondence was between Ray's great-grandfather and someone identified only as Professor M. These are from the 1920s, Ray said, scanning the first letter. Listen to this. The entity's hunger cycle appears to be approximately lunar. In nature, with increased activity during new moon phases, traditional containment methods remain effective, though the offerings must be increased in both frequency and potency as the entity adapts to our methods. Frank nodded grimly. Professor M was some kind of expert Dad consulted with for years. Never learned his full name. Family secrecy was paramount. But their correspondence went on for decades. Emma found another letter dated 1934. Professor M writes, I've located 3 similar manifestations in Vermont, Oregon, and northern Michigan. In each case, the containment failed when the Guardian families abandoned their posts. The subsequent events were catastrophic. Entire communities evacuated, official records sealed. We must ensure this does not happen at your location. The weight of their inheritance was becoming clearer with each document. This wasn't just a family burden. It was a responsibility that affected countless innocent people. If they failed, if they ran away or proved unable to maintain the containment, others would suffer the consequences. What kind of offerings? Ray asked, though he dreaded the answer. Frank's expression grew even more troubled. That's where things get complicated. In the early days, it was mostly animals. Livestock that died of natural causes, roadkill, that sort of thing. But over time, the thing's appetite grew more specific, more demanding. Emma looked up from the letters. The missing pets, among other things. Frank stood and walked to the window, staring out at the red glow with obvious distress. Your grandfather told me once that the thing fed on more than just flesh. It consumed life force, I guess you'd call it, the essence of living things. That's why the Guardians often died young. Maintaining the containment required them to share some of their own vital energy. Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with October weather. How much of their energy? Enough to keep it satisfied, but not enough to kill them immediately. Think of it as a slow drain, years or decades, of gradually weakening until their bodies just gave out. Frank turned back to face them, his expression grim. Your father lasted longer than most, 32 years of feeding that thing pieces of himself to keep it contained. Emma had gone very still, her pencil frozen above her notebook. That's why you left. That's why I ran. Frank corrected. "I was 18 years old and terrified, and I chose to save myself instead of doing my duty. I've spent 40 years wondering if that makes me a coward or the smart one in the family." Ray studied his uncle's face, seeing the guilt and relief warring in his expression. "Do you regret it? Every day, but not enough to come back?" Frank gathered up the letters with obvious reluctance. "The question now is what you're going to do. You have a choice, Ray, the same choice I had. You can stay and learn to be a guardian, or you can pack up Emma and leave tonight." "And if we leave?" Frank was quiet for a moment, then pointed toward the red glow in their backyard. "Look how active it's become in just the few days since your father died. Now imagine what happens when there's no one left to maintain any kind of containment at all." Emma closed her notebook and stood up. "We stay." Ray looked at his 16-year-old daughter, seeing Sarah's determination in the set of her jaw and the steady resolve in her dark eyes. She'd already lost her mother to forces beyond their control. She wasn't going to let others suffer if she could prevent it. "We stay," Ray agreed, though the words felt like signing his own death warrant. "But we're going to learn everything we can first. No more family secrets, no more partial information. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Frank nodded slowly. "Then we'd better start with the workshop. Your father left tools down there that you're going to need. Tools that have been in our family for generations." Outside, as if responding to their decision, the whispers from the hole grew louder and more insistent, carrying on the evening wind like voices from another world entirely. Thomas Henderson's workshop occupied the entire back section of the basement, hidden behind what appeared to be a standard storage room. Frank led them past shelves of paint cans and holiday decorations to a second false wall, this one secured with an intricate lock that required 3 different keys. "Your father was paranoid about security," Frank explained as he worked the locks, "with keys from Thomas's keyring. Said that some knowledge was too dangerous to leave accessible. The workshop beyond the false wall felt like stepping into a medieval apothecary. Shelves lined the walls, filled with glass jars containing substances Ray couldn't identify, powders, dried herbs, what looked like bone fragments, and liquids that seemed to shift color in the dim light. A workbench dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of use and stained with substances that Ray hoped were merely rust. Emma gravitated toward a collection of leather-bound notebooks, different from the journals upstairs. These were technical manuals, filled with diagrams, recipes, and step-by-step instructions written in Thomas Henderson's careful handwriting. "This is like a cookbook," she said, reading over one of the notebooks. "But instead of recipes for dinner, it's recipes for I don't even know what to call this stuff." Frank pulled a wooden box from beneath the workbench and set it on the scarred surface with obvious reverence. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay an assortment of tools that looked both ancient and purposeful. Knives with handles carved from what might have been bone, metal implements whose functions weren't immediately obvious, and at the center of the collection, a stone bowl that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "These have been in our family for 4 generations, Frank said. "Some of them might be older than that. Your great-great-grandfather acquired them from the previous landowners, whoever they were." Ray picked up one of the knives, noting how perfectly it fit his hand despite its obvious age. The blade was sharp enough to cut, but the metal had an odd quality to it, darker than steel and warm to the touch, even in the cool basement air. "What are they for?" "The offerings," Frank said simply. "The entity isn't satisfied with scraps anymore. It requires specific preparations, specific rituals. These tools help focus the energy transfer." Emma had found Thomas Henderson's final notebook, the one that detailed his last months as guardian. Her face grew paler as she read, and Ray could see her hands shaking slightly as she turned the pages. "Dad," she said quietly. Grandpa was getting weaker every month. According to his notes, he lost 12 pounds between August and September alone, and he was having chest pains, trouble breathing, episodes where he'd black out for minutes at a time. Ray took the notebook from Emma's trembling hands. The entries painted a picture of a man slowly dying, not from natural causes, but from the supernatural drain of maintaining the containment. Thomas Henderson had been feeding pieces of his own life force to the entity, and his body had finally reached its limits. The last entry is from 3 days before he died, Emma continued. He writes that he tried to perform a binding ritual, something that would strengthen the containment permanently. But it failed, and he thinks the failure made the entity stronger instead of weaker. Frank nodded grimly. That would explain why the hole opened so quickly after his death. Usually there's a grace period of several weeks before the containment begins to fail. But if Thomas weakened it with a botched ritual, Ray set down the notebook and studied the stone bowl. Its surface was covered with symbols similar to those on Catherine's locket, carved so deeply they seemed to disappear into the stone itself. When he touched the rim, he felt a strange tingling, as if the bowl was somehow alive. How do we know if we're doing this right? Ray asked. The notebooks give instructions, but they assume knowledge we don't have. What if we make the same mistake my father did? Frank was quiet for a long moment, examining the collection of tools with the expression of a man handling live ammunition. There's someone we could contact, someone who might have answers. Professor M. Dead for 20 years, but he had students, people who continued his research. Your father corresponded with one of them occasionally, a Dr. Elena Martinez, who teaches folklore and mythology at Penn State. She specializes in what she calls practical supernatural management. Emma looked up from the notebook she'd been studying. Does she know about our situation specifically? I don't think so. Your father was careful about operational security, but she might be able to provide guidance without needing to know all the details. Ray considered the option. Thomas Henderson's journals had emphasized the importance of secrecy, but they'd also made it clear that isolated guardians were more likely to fail. Perhaps controlled consultation with an expert was better than stumbling forward blindly. We'll contact her, Ray decided. But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with right now. The hole has been open for a week, and according to the journals, that's already longer than it should be sustainable. Frank led them through the notebooks, explaining the basics of containment theory as Thomas Henderson had understood it. The entity existed in a state of constant hunger, feeding on life force in various forms. The containment wasn't a prison in the traditional sense. It was more like a controlled feeding arrangement, providing just enough sustenance to keep the entity satisfied without allowing it to consume everything in its reach. Think of it as managing a dangerous pet, Frank explained. You have to feed it regularly, but you also have to maintain clear boundaries about what it's allowed to consume and when. The feeding schedule detailed in the notebooks was complex and specific. Small offerings of animal blood and organic matter every few days, larger rituals during lunar phases, and emergency procedures for when the entity became particularly active or demanding. Emma had been taking detailed notes, but now she set down her pencil and looked directly at her father. Dad, this is going to kill you. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but if you do this for 20 or 30 years like Grandpa did, it's going to drain your life away. Ray met his daughter's gaze, seeing his own fears reflected in her dark eyes. She was right, of course. The family. History was clear about the ultimate cost of guardianship. But the alternative, abandoning their post and allowing the entity to escape, was unthinkable. Then we'd better figure out a way to do this differently, Ray said. Maybe there's a solution the previous generations missed. Maybe Dr. Martinez has insights that could help us find a better way. Frank closed the wooden box of tools with a soft click. Your father tried for 32 years to find a better way. Every guardian in our family's history has tried. The entity adapts to whatever methods we use, grows stronger, becomes more demanding. It's not just hungry, it's intelligent. As if responding to their conversation, the house shuddered slightly, a tremor that seemed to originate from somewhere deep beneath the foundation. Through the basement windows, they could see the red glow from the hole, pulsing more rapidly, like a heartbeat accelerating with excitement. The entity knew they were discussing it, and it was eager to meet its new guardians. Dr. Elena Martinez arrived on a grey Saturday morning, driving a mud-splattered jeep, loaded with equipment that looked more suited to an archaeological dig than an academic consultation. She was younger than Ray had expected, maybe 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen things most people wouldn't believe. "I brought ground-penetrating radar and electromagnetic field detectors," she said without preamble, hauling a metal case from the back of her jeep. "Also some items that aren't exactly standard academic equipment, in case your situation is what I think it might be." Ray had been careful during their phone conversation, describing their problem in vague terms as unusual geological phenomena with possible historical significance. But Dr. Martinez's matter-of-fact preparation suggested she'd read between the lines. "How much do you actually know?" Emma asked, helping carry equipment toward the backyard. "Enough to recognize the symptoms when I hear them described. And enough to know that families like yours have been dealing with these situations for generations, usually without adequate support or understanding." Dr. Martinez stopped at the edge of the overgrown area, studying the red glow that pulsed steadily from the hole. "Though I'll admit this is more active than most of the sites I've investigated." She spent the morning conducting what she called baseline measurements, using her equipment to map the electromagnetic and thermal signatures around the hole. The readings were unlike anything in her experience, she explained, showing energy patterns that defied conventional physics. "The heat signature extends down at least 30 feet before my instruments lose the signal," she said, studying a tablet display. "But the electromagnetic reading suggests something much deeper, possibly extending into the bedrock itself." Frank had retreated to the house after brief introductions, claiming that his old bones couldn't handle the morning chill. But Ray suspected his uncle simply didn't want to be present for whatever Dr. Martinez might discover. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued, adjusting her equipment. "The field readings are fluctuating in response to our presence. Whatever's down there is aware that we're here." Emma shivered, wrapping her jacket more tightly around herself. Over the past week, her supernatural sensitivity had become more pronounced. She could predict when the hole's activity would increase, often feeling nauseated or dizzy minutes before the whispers began or the red glow intensified. "It's getting restless," Emma said quietly, "like it knows we're talking about it." Dr. Martinez looked at Emma with obvious interest. "You're sensitive to its moods?" "She's been having dreams too," Ray added, "and physical reactions to changes in the entity's behavior. That's not uncommon in guardian families. The sensitivity often manifests in the younger generation first." Dr. Martinez packed away her instruments and pulled out what looked like an ancient stone tablet, roughly the size of a hardcover book. "I'd like to try something, but it might be unsettling for Emma." The tablet was covered with symbols similar to those they'd found on Catherine's locket and in Thomas Henderson's workshop, but these carvings seemed more elaborate, arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. "This is a communication device," Dr. Martinez explained. "Not exactly a conversation, more like controlled contact. It allows us to gauge the entity's current state without triggering a full manifestation." Ray didn't like the sound of that. "What kind of manifestation?" "The kind that usually results in someone getting hurt or killed. Which is why we need to understand what we're dealing with before attempting any containment procedures." Dr. Martinez placed the tablet on the ground near the hole's edge, then gestured for Ray and Emma to step back several feet. Almost immediately, the red glow began pulsing more rapidly, and the temperature around them dropped noticeably. The symbols on the tablet began to glow with the same reddish light as the hole, and Ray heard a sound that made his skin crawl. Not quite speech, but definitely communication. It was like listening to someone talk underwater, the words distorted, but the intent unmistakable. Emma gasped and grabbed Ray's arm. "It's angry. Really, really angry." "At us?" Ray asked. "At Grandpa. At the family. It says we broke our promise." Emma's voice was strained, as if she was fighting not to listen to whatever the entity was communicating. It's been waiting for decades for someone to feed it properly, and Grandpa wasn't giving it what it needed. Dr. Martinez was taking rapid notes, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. "The communication is much clearer than I expected. Usually these entities are barely coherent after decades of containment. This one has maintained its intelligence and its memory." The tablet's glow intensified, and suddenly Emma cried out in pain, doubling over as if she'd been punched in the stomach. Ray rushed to her side, but she waved him away. "I'm okay," she gasped. "But it's showing me things, memories, I think." "What kind of memories?" Emma straightened slowly, her face pale but determined. "It's showing me the people who imprisoned it originally. Native Americans, but not any tribe I recognize. They performed some kind of binding ritual that trapped it here. But the binding was supposed to be temporary, just long enough for them to find a permanent solution." Dr. Martinez looked up from her notes. "But they never did. They died. All of them, in a single winter. Disease, maybe smallpox. The entity was left bound, but not properly contained, and over time the binding weakened. That's when it started affecting the families who lived on the land. The tablet's glow began to fade, and the oppressive atmosphere around the hole lifted slightly. Dr. Martinez carefully picked up the stone artifact, wrapping it in a cloth that seemed designed specifically for the purpose. "This changes everything," she said. "If the original binding is still partially intact, we might be able to strengthen it instead of just managing the entity's hunger. But it would require understanding the specific techniques used by the original binders." Ray felt a spark of hope for the first time since they discovered the hole. "You think there's a way to contain it permanently?" "Possibly. But first we need to research the historical record, find out which tribe originally occupied this land, and whether any of their binding techniques survived in oral tradition or written accounts." Dr. Martinez began packing her equipment with efficient movements. "In the meantime, you'll need to maintain the basic feeding schedule. The entity is already showing signs of dangerous instability." Emma had recovered from her supernatural contact, but Ray could see the encounter had drained her. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile, and he wondered how much exposure to the entity's influence she could safely handle. "How long do we have?" Ray asked. "Based on what I've seen today, maybe 2 weeks before the containment fails completely. After that, the entity will be free to manifest physically, and the consequences will extend far beyond your property." Frank appeared on the back porch, gesturing for them to come inside. "Everything okay out there? The house has been shaking for the past 10 minutes. Dr. Martinez glanced back at the hole, where the red glow had settled into a steady, ominous pulse. "We've gotten its attention, now the real work begins." As they walked toward the house, Ray noticed that the symbols carved into the trees around the property's perimeter were glowing faintly, as if responding to their conversation with the entity. Whatever his ancestors had done to contain this threat, it was beginning to unravel, and time was running out to find a better solution. Ray found the medical records by accident while searching through a box of Sarah's personal effects that he'd never had the courage to open. He'd been looking for her grandmother's recipe book, something Emma had requested for a school project, when his fingers closed around a manila folder he didn't remember packing. Inside were copies of Sarah's medical files from her oncologist, Dr. Patricia Reeves. Ray had seen most of these documents before, during the endless months of appointments and treatments, but one file was unfamiliar. It was marked Consultation, external factors, and dated just 3 weeks before Sarah's. Diagnosis. Ray opened the file with trembling hands, reading words that made his world tilt on its axis. Patient presence with unusual cellular deterioration patterns inconsistent with typical environmental carcinogens, Dr. Reeves had written. Symptoms began approximately 48 hours following patient's return from family visit to rural Pennsylvania. Improperty. Initial blood work shows significant elevation in stress markers and immune system suppression that cannot be attributed to known toxins or pathogens. Ray sank into Thomas Henderson's old recliner, the medical file spreading across his lap like evidence of a crime he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Reeves had requested additional testing, environmental assessments, even consultation with specialists in unusual occupational exposures. But Sarah had declined further investigation, claiming she felt fine despite the bloodwork abnormalities. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. Patient's condition has deteriorated rapidly. Pancreatic enzyme levels suggest advanced cellular damage, but progression is unlike any natural disease pattern in my experience. Recommend immediate biopsy and aggressive diagnostic workup. Ray remembered that appointment. Sarah had been tired, complaining of stomach pain and unexplained weight loss. They'd both assumed it was stress from his struggling business and the pressures of middle age. The possibility that her illness might be connected to their visit to his father's house had never occurred to either of them, but it should have occurred to Thomas Henderson. Ray found Emma in the kitchen working on homework while Frank prepared dinner. She looked up as Ray entered, immediately sensing his distress. "Dad, what's wrong?" Ray spread the medical files across the kitchen table, pushing aside Emma's textbooks and notebooks. "Your mother's cancer wasn't natural." Frank stopped stirring the pot of soup he'd been making and turned to stare at Ray. "What do you mean?" "I mean the entity caused it. Somehow, during our last visit here 5 years ago, Sarah was exposed to something that started killing her." Ray's voice was getting louder, anger and grief warring in his chest. "And my father knew. He had to know." Emma read through the files with growing horror. "It says here that Mom's symptoms started right after. You visited Grandpa. That can't be a coincidence." Frank sat heavily at the table, his face pale. "The entity feeds on life force, but exposure doesn't usually cause immediate illness. There would have to be direct contact or what?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying the medical documents with obvious reluctance. There were stories, family legends about the entity being able to mark people, create a connection that would allow it to feed from them even at a distance. Ray felt cold despite the kitchen's warmth. "You think it marked Sarah?" "I think your father was dying, and he was getting desperate. The journals talk about the entity becoming more demanding as guardians age and weaken. Maybe Thomas tried to supplement his offerings with energy from outside sources." Emma slammed her hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. "You're saying Grandpa deliberately made Mom sick to feed that thing?" "I'm saying he might have had no choice. If the entity was threatening to break containment, if it needed more life force than Thomas could provide alone." Ray stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. "No, there's always a choice. He could have called us, warned us, asked for help. Instead, he used my wife as an unwilling sacrifice to buy himself more time." The house shuddered around them, responding to Ray's anger. The red glow from the backyard intensified, pulsing in rhythm with his elevated heartbeat. Emma gasped and pressed her hands to her temples. "It's getting stronger," she said. "The entity. It's feeding off your emotions somehow. Dr. Martinez had left them with instructions for emergency containment procedures, but Ray barely remembered them through his rage and grief. His father had killed Sarah, maybe not directly, but through deliberate action that had marked her for consumption by something that should never have been allowed to touch her. "There's more," Frank said quietly, pulling a letter from his jacket pocket. "I didn't want to show you this, but after what you found..." The letter was addressed to Thomas Henderson, dated 6 months before Sarah's diagnosis. The return address was a post office box in Philadelphia, the city where Ray and Sarah had lived. Ray recognized his father's careful handwriting immediately. The entity requires additional sustenance. Local sources are insufficient, and my own life force is nearly depleted. I have identified a suitable supplemental source, someone with family connection but no knowledge of our situation. The marking procedure will be subtle, designed to create a slow drain that appears natural to outside observers. This solution will provide the entity with necessary nourishment while maintaining operational security. The letter was signed and dated, a cold-blooded planning document for his wife's murder. Emma was crying now, huge, silent tears that ran down her cheeks as she read over Ray's shoulder. He killed Mom. Grandpa killed Mom to feed that monster. Frank tried to reach for Emma's hand, but she pulled away. Emma, you have to understand. Understand what? That sometimes good people have to murder innocent women to keep monsters happy. Emma's voice was getting higher, more hysterical. That Mom had to die of cancer so that thing could stay in its hole? Ray felt something break inside his chest, a dam that had been holding back months of suppressed rage and grief. Sarah had suffered for 14 months, wasting away while he helplessly watched, and all that time, the real cause of her illness had been sitting in this house, feeding off her slow death. The entity had been consuming his wife piece by piece, growing stronger while Ray held her hand through chemotherapy sessions and radiation treatments, and the final brutal weeks when the pain medication stopped working and she begged him to let her die with some dignity. I'm going to kill it, Ray said quietly. Frank stood up, alarmed by Ray's tone. Ray, that's exactly what Catherine tried to do, and Aunt Catherine disappeared, remember? The entity consumed her for her defiance. Maybe Catherine didn't have the right tools. Maybe she didn't understand what she was fighting. Ray walked to the basement door, his movements deliberate and controlled. But I do. I know exactly what it is and exactly what it's done to my family. Emma followed him toward the basement, wiping tears from her face. Dad, you can't. If you try to destroy it and fail, it'll break free completely. Dr. Martinez said the consequences would be catastrophic. Ray paused at the top of the basement stairs, looking back at his 16-year-old daughter who'd already lost her mother and was now facing the possibility of losing her father to the same supernatural threat. Then I won't fail. Frank appeared. Behind them, his expression desperate. There's something else, something I should have told you earlier. He pulled out another document, this one much older and written in faded German script. This belonged to our great-great-grandfather. I had it translated years ago. The translation revealed the truth that Frank had been hiding. The entity wasn't just imprisoned on their land. It was connected to Emma through her bloodline, through generations of Henderson women who'd served as unwilling anchors for the binding. As long as a female descendant lived on the property, the entity remained partially contained. But if Emma left or died, the ancient binding would collapse completely. You mean I'm not just Emma Henderson, Emma said quietly. I'm some kind of supernatural battery keeping that thing locked up. Frank nodded miserably. The marking Thomas did to your mother wasn't just about feeding the entity. It was about ensuring that you would eventually come here, ensuring the family line continued, ensuring there would always be an anchor for the binding. Ray understood now why his father had been so insistent about Ray staying close to home, learning the family business. Thomas Henderson hadn't been trying to trap his son in a small-town life. He'd been trying to ensure that Emma would grow up knowing about her supernatural inheritance. Instead, Ray's estrangement had left Emma ignorant and vulnerable, an unwitting anchor whose presence both contained the entity and marked her as its ultimate target. The entity hadn't just killed Sarah. It had orchestrated her death as part of a decades-long plan to claim Emma as its permanent host. Ray spent The rest of that evening in Thomas Henderson's workshop, studying the ritual implements with the focused intensity of a man planning war. The obsidian dagger lay before him on the scarred workbench, its black surface seeming to absorb the light from the overhead bulb. According to the oldest family documents, this blade had been crafted specifically for what the journals called terminal intervention, the complete destruction of the entity, regardless of the cost to the guardian performing the ritual. Emma sat across from him, having insisted on helping, despite Ray's protests that she should stay upstairs with Frank. Her supernatural sensitivity had grown stronger throughout the day, and she claimed she could feel the entity's anticipation building, like static electricity before a thunderstorm. "It knows we found out the truth," she said, flipping through the technical manual that detailed the destruction ritual. "Ever since you read Mom's medical files, it's been excited, like it's been waiting for this confrontation." Ray looked up from the dagger, noting how pale Emma had become. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The entity's connection to her was growing stronger, and he wondered how much time they had before it could exert direct control over her actions. "Maybe that's because it wants to be destroyed," Ray said. "Think about it. Decades of imprisonment, feeding off scraps and the life force of reluctant guardians. Maybe death would be preferable to continued containment." Emma shook her head. "No, that's not what I'm sensing. It's not eager to die, it's eager to win, like it's been playing a long game that's finally reaching checkmate." Frank appeared at the workshop door, carrying a tray with sandwiches and coffee. He moved carefully, as if afraid that sudden movements might trigger some kind of supernatural response. The house had been creaking and settling all evening, responding to the emotional tension that filled the air like a living thing. "Dr. Martinez called," Frank reported, setting down the tray. "She's found references to the original binding ritual in some archived tribal documents from the Seneca Nation. She thinks she can reconstruct the procedure, but it would take at least a week to gather the necessary materials." "We don't have a week," Emma said quietly. "I can feel the containment weakening, maybe 2 days before it fails completely." Ray studied the obsidian dagger, testing its weight and balance. The handle fit his grip perfectly, as if it had been crafted for his hand specifically. According to the ritual instructions, the blade needed to be driven directly into the heart of the entity during its moment of maximum manifestation, the brief period when it became fully corporeal in order to break free from its prison. "The destruction ritual requires the guardian to enter the whole," Ray said, reading from the manual. "Physical contact with the entity in its domain. The dagger has to pierce its core essence while it's trying to escape." Frank set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. "Ray, that's suicide. No one has ever returned from direct contact with the entity in its whole. Catherine tried it and disappeared completely. Catherine didn't have the right tools or the right knowledge. She was working from incomplete information." Ray traced one finger along the dagger's edge, noting how sharp it remained despite its obvious age. "And she didn't have the motivation I have." Emma looked up from the manual, her eyes wide with understanding. "You're not planning to destroy it. You're planning to trade places with it." Ray met his daughter's gaze, seeing his own determination reflected in her face. She'd inherited more than supernatural sensitivity from the Henderson bloodline. She'd inherited the intelligence to see through his careful omissions and half-truths. "The ritual doesn't actually kill the entity," Ray admitted. "It transfers the binding from the land to the guardian performing the ceremony. The guardian becomes a permanent prison, containing the entity within their own life force until they die." "And when you die?" Frank asked quietly. "The entity dies with me. Permanent solution. No more family curse. No more innocent people getting hurt." Ray set down the dagger and looked at both Emma and Frank. "It's the only way to end this." "For good?" Emma stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. "No, absolutely not. You are not sacrificing yourself because you feel guilty about Mom. This isn't about guilt. Bullshit. Emma's language startled both Ray and Frank, but her anger gave her words a cutting force. This is exactly about guilt. You couldn't save. Mum, so now you're going to save everyone else by dying heroically. But what about me, Dad? What happens to me when you're gone? Ray had been dreading this conversation, but Emma deserved honesty. Frank will take care of you. You'll go live with him in Pittsburgh, finish high school, go to college, have a normal life away from all this supernatural garbage. A normal life? Emma's voice was getting higher, more hysterical. Dad, I'm connected to that thing. The binding is tied to Henderson women, remember? If you die containing the entity, what happens to the connection I already have with it? Ray felt his carefully constructed plan beginning to unravel. He'd been so focused on the mechanics of the destruction ritual that he hadn't fully considered the supernatural bonds that connected Emma to the entity through generations of family history. Frank cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. There's something else. Something I learned from Dr. Martinez's research today. He pulled out a folder of photocopied documents. The original Seneca binding wasn't just about imprisoning the entity. It was about transforming it. The shamans who created the containment were trying to cleanse the entity of its hunger. Essentially rehabilitation rather than punishment. Ray studied the documents, noting diagrams that showed the entity's prison as part of a larger spiritual ecosystem. The hole wasn't just a cage, it was meant to be a healing chamber where the entity could gradually release its need to consume. Life force, you're saying the native shamans were trying to cure it? Emma asked. I'm saying they believed that even supernatural predators could be redeemed if given proper guidance and sufficient time. Frank pointed to a section of translated text. But the process was interrupted when the shamans died. The entity was left partially transformed, caught between its original nature and whatever it was supposed to become. Emma sat back down, her anger replaced by thoughtful consideration. What if we could complete the original process instead of just destroying the entity? Ray shook his head. Too risky. We don't have the knowledge or the spiritual training of the original shamans. One mistake and we could make the entity more dangerous instead of less. One mistake with your destruction ritual and you're dead, Emma countered. At least my way, we both survive. The house shuddered around them, and the workshop lights flickered. Through the basement windows, they could see the red glow from the hole intensifying, pulsing faster as if responding to their conversation. Frank gathered up the scattered documents with obvious urgency. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide quickly. The entity is getting agitated, and I don't think this house can take much more supernatural stress before something structural gives way. Ray looked at his daughter, seeing Sarah's stubborn determination in the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes. Emma had lost her mother to the entity's manipulations, but she'd also inherited enough of the Henderson family gift to potentially succeed where previous generations had failed. If we try the cleansing ritual and it doesn't work, Ray said carefully, we might not get a second chance. The entity could break free completely, and then everyone in the surrounding area would be at risk. Emma nodded, understanding the stakes. But if we don't try, you die. And I spend the rest of my life wondering if there was another way. Plus, I'm still connected to the thing. What happens to that connection if you contain it within yourself? Frank looked up from the documents he'd been organizing. According to these translations, the guardian performing a binding ritual becomes a permanent anchor. All existing family connections would be severed and redirected through the guardian. Emma would be free of the supernatural bond, but Ray would bear the full weight of containing the entity until his natural death. Ray considered the implications. His death would free Emma from the family curse entirely, allowing her to live without the supernatural burden that had claimed so many Henderson lives. It seemed like a fair trade, his life for her freedom. But Emma was right about his motivations. Part of him wanted to die heroically, to somehow balance the scales for his failure to protect Sarah. Another part of him was simply tired, worn down by grief and loss, and the weight of responsibilities he'd never chosen. "We have until tomorrow night," Emma said, checking the lunar calendar in Thomas Henderson's notebook. "New moon. According to the journals, that's when the entity will be strong enough to manifest physically and attempt its escape." Ray picked up the obsidian dagger again, feeling its weight and balance. Tomorrow night, one way or another, the Henderson family's long guardianship would come to an end. The only question was whether it would end in sacrifice, redemption, or catastrophic failure. Outside, the entity's whispers had begun again, drifting up from the hole like prayers in a language that predated human speech. But now, Ray thought, he could detect something different in those alien voices. Not just hunger, but longing. Perhaps even hope. Maybe the native shamans had been right. Maybe even monsters could be saved, given proper guidance and sufficient courage. The new moon rose, invisible against the October sky, its absence marked only by the unusual darkness that settled over the Henderson property like a heavy blanket. Ray stood at the kitchen window, watching the hole's red glow intensify with each passing hour. According to Thomas Henderson's journals, the entity's power peaked during the darkest nights, when the barrier between its prison and the physical world grew thin enough for it to manifest completely. Emma had spent the day in meditation, following techniques Dr. Martinez had taught her for managing supernatural sensitivity. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, breathing slowly and deeply while monitoring the entity's emotional state through their unwanted connection. "It's excited," she reported during their final planning session, "like a prisoner who can see the guards changing shift and knows this is the best chance for escape." Frank had returned from town with supplies: salt, silver powder, herbs that Dr. Martinez claimed would help focus spiritual energy. The items were arranged on the kitchen table like ingredients for a recipe none of them wanted to cook. Ray checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. According to the astronomical charts, lunar midnight would occur at 12:23 a.m., the moment when the moon's influence would be completely absent from the sky. That's when the entity would make its move. "Last chance to change your mind," Ray said to Emma. "You could stay in the house with Frank while I handle this alone." Emma opened her eyes and fixed her father with a steady gaze. "We've been over this. The cleansing ritual requires two people, one to anchor the entity's current form and one to guide its transformation. I'm the only one with strong enough sensitivity to maintain the connection." Ray hated putting his 16-year-old daughter in danger, but Emma was right about the ritual requirements. The original Seneca shamans had worked in pairs, with the more sensitive partner serving as a spiritual conduit, while the other performed the actual cleansing procedures. At 12:15 a.m., the house began to shake. It started as a subtle vibration, like a large truck passing on a distant highway, but the tremor quickly intensified, rattling dishes in the cabinets and causing the overhead lights to flicker. Frank retreated to the basement, claiming he could monitor the situation from there while staying out of the way. Ray and Emma moved to the back porch, carrying the ritual supplies and the obsidian dagger as a backup option. The hole had expanded to nearly 6 feet across, and the red glow was so bright it hurt to look at directly. Heat radiated from the opening in waves, turning the October air above it into visible distortions. "It's starting," Emma said, her voice tight with concentration. "I can feel it gathering strength, preparing to manifest." The whispers from the hole had stopped entirely, replaced by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Ray could feel the sound in his bones, a frequency that resonated with something primitive and fearful in his nervous system. At exactly 12:23 a.m., the entity began to emerge. What rose from the hole wasn't the shadowy monster Ray had expected. Instead, a column of shifting light poured upward, red and gold in colors that had no names, forming itself into a vaguely humanoid shape that towered 15 feet above the ground. The entity's face was beautiful and terrible, with features that seemed to shift between human and something entirely alien. Emma gasped and staggered backward, her connection to the entity suddenly flooded with its raw emotional state. "It's not evil," she said, wonder and terror warring in her voice. "It's just hungry. It's been hungry for so long that it's forgotten how to be anything else." Ray stepped forward, raising the obsidian dagger. The entity's attention focused on him immediately, and he felt a pressure in his mind like someone trying to force open a locked door. Then Sarah appeared. She materialized beside the entity, translucent but unmistakably present, wearing the same blue dress she'd been buried in 6 months ago. But her face was peaceful, free of the pain and exhaustion that had marked her final weeks. "Ray!" Sarah's voice was like wind through leaves, barely audible but clear. "Don't let anger make your choice for you." Ray's hand tightened on the daggers. "Handle. It killed you. It used my father to mark you for death." Sarah's spirit moved closer, and Ray felt warmth that had nothing to do with the hole's supernatural heat. "I chose to come back, to help you understand. The entity isn't your enemy. It's a victim, just like I was." Emma was struggling to maintain her mental connection with the entity while processing Sarah's unexpected appearance. "Mom's right," she said through gritted teeth. "I can see the entity's memories. It didn't choose to be a hunger. Something made it this way, twisted it from whatever it originally was." The entity's form flickered, becoming more solid as it fed on the spiritual energy surrounding the manifestation. Ray realized they had perhaps minutes before it became strong enough to leave the immediate area and begin consuming everything in its path. "The cleansing ritual," Sarah urged. "It's the only way to heal both the entity and our family." Ray looked at the obsidian dagger in his hand, then at his daughter, who was risking her sanity to maintain contact with a supernatural predator, then at his wife's spirit, who had somehow returned from death to guide them toward redemption instead of revenge. Boom. Entity reached toward Emma with one massive, shifting hand, and Ray had to choose. Ray dropped the obsidian dagger and reached for Emma's hand instead. The moment their fingers touched, he felt the full force of the entity's consciousness flooding through their shared connection. It was like being caught in a riptide of alien emotion. Centuries of desperate hunger, confusion, and a loneliness so profound it made Ray's grief over Sarah seem small in comparison. The entity had once been something else entirely. Through Emma's enhanced sensitivity, Ray glimpsed memories that stretched back before human civilization, a being of pure creative energy, responsible for nurturing new life across vast cosmic distances. But something had corrupted it, twisted its nature from creation to consumption, trapping it in a cycle of hunger that grew stronger with each feeding. "I can see what it was meant to be," Emma said, her voice strained but determined. "It was like a gardener helping things grow instead of consuming them. But the corruption changed its fundamental nature." Sarah's spirit moved closer, her presence providing stability as Ray and Emma began the cleansing ritual. "The original shamans understood," she said. "Healing requires connection, not separation. You have to join with it to transform it." Ray began speaking the words Dr. Martinez had translated from the Seneca documents, ancient syllables that felt foreign on his tongue but somehow correct. The entity's towering form flickered, becoming more translucent as the ritual took hold. But something was fighting the cleansing process. Emma cried out in pain as a secondary presence made itself known. Not the entity they were trying to heal, but something else entirely. A dark intelligence that had been using the entity as a host, feeding off its supernatural hunger while remaining hidden from the Henderson family's containment efforts. "There's something else in there," Emma gasped, her grip on Ray's hand tightening. "Something that doesn't want to be cleansed." The parasitic presence revealed itself as a writhing mass of shadow that separated from the entity's light form like oil rising to the surface of water. This was the true source of corruption, an ancient malevolence that had infected the entity eons ago and had been using it as a vehicle for destruction ever since. Ray understood now why the original shaman's cleansing ritual had failed. They'd been trying to heal the entity without realizing it was being controlled by something far more dangerous. The shadow presence lashed out at Emma, trying to break her connection to the entity and prevent the cleansing from continuing. Ray felt his daughter's pain through their joined hands as the parasite attacked her mind directly, showing her visions of everyone she loved dying in agony. "Hold on," Ray urged, pouring his own strength through their connection. "Don't let it break the link." Sarah's spirit interposed herself between the shadow and Emma, her presence blazing with protective light. "This is why I came back," she said, her voice growing stronger, "to help you separate the victim from the predator." The entity, freed from the parasite's direct control for the first time in millennia, began to remember what it had once been. Ray felt its consciousness changing, the desperate hunger transforming into something else, gratitude, hope, and a desperate desire for redemption. But the shadow presence wasn't finished. Realizing it was about to lose its host, it made one final attempt to maintain control by possessing Emma directly. Ray felt the exact moment when the parasite invaded his daughter's mind. Emma's body went rigid, her eyes rolling back to show only whites, and when she spoke again, her voice carried harmonics that no human throat should produce. "You cannot cleanse what has been willingly corrupted," the thing said through Emma's mouth. "I have fed on suffering for 10,000 years. Your family's grief has sustained me beautifully." Ray realized with horror that the Henderson family's history of early death and supernatural servitude hadn't been the entity's doing at all. The shadow parasite had been orchestrating everything, using the family's guardian tradition to provide itself with a steady supply of life force while keeping its true nature hidden. Sarah's spirit blazed brighter, her form becoming more solid, as she drew upon every ounce of love and protective instinct she possessed. "Ray, you have to complete the cleansing now, while the entity is free of the parasite's influence." The cleansed entity, now recognizable as the benevolent force it had originally been, reached toward Emma with genuine compassion rather than hunger. Ray understood what needed to happen. The entity could heal Emma by absorbing the parasite into itself, but only if Ray was willing to trust completely in the transformation they'd begun. "Do it," Ray said to the entity, releasing Emma's hand. And stepping back, the entity's light form enveloped Emma, and Ray heard the parasite scream as it was torn from her mind and absorbed into the cleansed being's consciousness. But instead of being consumed, the malevolent presence was transformed, its hunger and malice dissolving into the same creative energy that powered the entity's original nature. Emma collapsed, unconscious but breathing, as the ritual reached its completion. The hole in their backyard sealed itself with a sound like distant thunder, leaving behind nothing but ordinary earth that smelled of rain and growing things. The cleansed entity hovered above them for a moment, its form now beautiful and serene, before dissolving into points of light that scattered across the October sky like falling stars. Sarah's spirit smiled and began to fade. "Take care of each other," she said, her voice growing distant. "The curse is broken. You're free." Ray knelt beside Emma's unconscious form, checking her pulse and breathing. She was alive, truly alive, without the supernatural connection that had been draining her strength for weeks. For the first time since Sarah's diagnosis, Ray felt something that might have been peace. 6 months later, Ray stood in what had once been Thomas Henderson's workshop, now converted into his carpentry studio. The basement still smelled faintly of machine oil and old wood, but the supernatural oppression that had once filled the space was completely gone. Sunlight streamed through new windows he'd installed, illuminating sawdust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Emma appeared at the top of the basement stairs, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of a teenager who'd just aced a difficult exam. Her color had returned over the winter months, the hollow cheeks and dark circles replaced by the healthy glow of a 16-year-old who was finally sleeping through the night. "Mrs. Patterson wants to commission another dining set," Emma reported, setting 1 cup on Ray's workbench. "She saw the table you made for the Garcias and wants something similar for her daughter's wedding." Ray smiled, running his hand along the smooth surface of a cedar chest he'd been crafting. His new business, Henderson Restoration, had grown beyond his expectations. Word had spread throughout rural Pennsylvania about the quiet widower who could repair antique furniture with skills that seemed almost magical. He specialized in pieces that other craftsmen claimed were beyond saving, finding ways to restore beauty and function to objects that others had given up on. The irony wasn't lost on him. "How's your college application coming?" Ray asked, noting the stack of paperwork Emma had been carrying. "Penn State accepted me into their environmental science program," Emma said, unable to hide her excitement. "I want to study conservation, maybe work with the Park Service helping protect natural habitats." Ray felt a familiar pang of pride mixed with anticipation of loss. Emma would leave for college in the fall, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he'd be truly alone. But it was the right kind of alone, the solitude of a man whose work was complete rather than the isolation of someone carrying burdens too heavy to share. They climbed the basement stairs together, emerging into the farmhouse's main floor. Ray had spent the winter renovating the old place, stripping away decades of neglect and revealing the solid craftsmanship underneath. The house felt lighter now, filled with the kind of comfortable warmth that comes from being well-maintained rather than simply endured. Through the kitchen window, Ray could see their backyard garden thriving in the spring sunshine. Where the hole had once smoldered, Emma had planted a memorial garden for Sarah, roses and herbs and flowering shrubs that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. The soil there was remarkably fertile, producing blooms that were larger and more vibrant than anything else in the area. Frank had moved back to the farmhouse in February, claiming his retirement community was too quiet and he missed having family nearby. Ray suspected his uncle's real motivation was making sure Ray and Emma didn't face their new normal entirely alone, but he was grateful for the company. Frank had taken over cooking duties and appointed himself Emma's unofficial college preparation advisor. "Your uncle wants to know if you're planning to keep the property after Emma goes to school," Frank said, appearing from the living room with a newspaper and reading glasses. "He's worried you'll get lonely out here by yourself." Ray considered the question while looking out at the garden where Sarah's memorial bloomed in defiant abundance. The house held memories now, good ones mixed with the difficult ones, and he'd grown attached to the sense of peace that had settled over the property since the cleansing ritual. "I think I'll stay," Ray said. "This feels like home now." Emma was arranging flowers in a vase, white roses from Sarah's memorial garden mixed with wildflowers from the surrounding fields. She'd taken up photography over the winter, documenting the subtle changes in the landscape as the supernatural influence faded and natural patterns reasserted themselves. "I have something for you," Emma said, pulling a wrapped package from behind the counter. "Early Father's Day present." Ray unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a framed photograph Emma had taken the previous week. It showed Ray working in his basement studio, concentration evident in his posture as he shaped wood with tools that had been passed down through generations. But the focus of the image was the light streaming through the windows, illuminating both craftsman and craft. With golden warmth, below the photograph, Emma had written a simple caption, "New family photo." Ray felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. For months after Sarah's death, he'd avoided looking at family pictures, unable to bear the reminder of what he'd lost. But Emma's photograph captured something different, not the past they could never recover, but the future they were building together. "Thank you," he said quietly, setting the frame on the kitchen windowsill where it would catch the morning light. "Your mother would be proud of the young woman you've become." Emma smiled, but Ray could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Do you think she knows? About what we did? About how things turned out?" Ray looked out at the memorial garden, where a cardinal had landed among the roses and was singing with remarkable volume and joy. Sarah had always loved cardinals, claiming they were messengers from departed loved ones. "I think she knows," Ray said, "and I think she's at peace." That evening, as Ray worked alone in his basement studio, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The entity was gone, transformed back into the benevolent force it had originally been. The shadow parasite that had corrupted it for millennia had been cleansed rather than destroyed, its malevolence converted into creative energy. Emma was free from the supernatural burden that had claimed so many Henderson lives. She would go to college, build a career, maybe have a family of her own someday, all without the weight of otherworldly responsibilities that her ancestors had carried. Frank had found a new purpose in helping Ray establish his restoration business and preparing Emma for independence. The guilt that had haunted him for 40 years had finally been replaced by the satisfaction of contributing to his family's healing. Ray picked up Sarah's wedding ring from its place of honor on his workbench, holding the simple band up to catch the light. He'd stopped wearing it around his neck months ago, but he kept it close while he worked, a reminder of love that had survived even supernatural manipulation and death. Tomorrow, he would start work on a rocking chair for the Hendersons' old neighbors, whose first grandchild was due in the fall. Next week, he would help Emma pack for a summer internship with the State Conservation Department. In the fall, he would drive her to college and trust that he'd given her the tools she needed for whatever challenges lay ahead. For the first time in years, Ray Henderson was planning for the future rather than just surviving the present. The curse that had shaped his family's destiny for generations was finally broken, replaced by the simple, extraordinary possibility of ordinary happiness. Outside, spring rain began to fall, nourishing Sarah's memorial garden and washing away the last traces of winter's grip on the land.